work it might be demonstrating challenging behavior. That's where I do my job. And I always say challenging behavior is defined by the environment. So, depending on where you are, I mean, vocal behavior can become challenging, right? Someone too loud, too long, disrupting others in the media center might be very challenging. But if you're in a center-based program, it might be vocal behavior all day, we don't even notice that, right? And it's not challenging until someone's getting hurt or there's blood, right? And then we're talking challenge. So it's really defined by the environment, more so than by the behavior. So I have a pretty broad range of what folks find challenging that I would work with. And any kind of label or diagnosis or not. I mean, any one of us could target a behavior and look at how we would change that based on why we do that. So a lot of my understanding of the behavior of others is really understanding my own behavior. I think it's so funny they say you teach what you need to learn, and I teach behavior change. There might be a whole reality TV show in there somewhere, right? Oh, well, who knows? But today, I'm wanting to cover, a lot of things. Some of it is just more sort of theoretical. Why does behavior happen? Because I think the better we understand that, the better we are at knowing what we could do to change it, and where we're limited in changing the behavior of others. Because there are a lot of ways that we will be limited, especially in the context that you're working in school. You're going to have limitations around what you can change in others. So I think we need to really understand that, and then work with what we can do, and that's how we'll kind of end our afternoon, or what strategies can we use, what things can we do consistently across all the students we're working with that will be helpful. So that's kind of what we're talking about. I welcome questions and discussion. It might change us a little bit in terms of what we're talking about, but that's okay. I think it makes it more applicable to you. So please ask or offer comments if they come up. So I want to start a little bit with what I call the ground rules of behavior change. And these are some sort of principles of behavior that I think is really important to think about as we start to think about, what others might bring to the table as far as their behaviors and what we're going to do about that or not. Is to think about sort of what it means to think about changing that. The first ground rule is that all behavior is reinforced. And what that means is anything you see your coworkers, your family, yourself, or your students doing in this moment, they're doing it because it has a history of working for them. For them. Maybe not for anybody else, but for that individual, this behavior works. That's what a history of reinforcement means. Punishment happens, it does. We all have a history of it, but that's not why we behave. That's why we avoid behaving in certain ways. Why we choose to behave this way right now is because this behavior has worked for me in the past. This tool is right at the top of my toolbox because it works. And I think that's a really important first assumption as you're presented with a challenge from somebody else. You're challenged, so right away, this is not working for you. Your screaming is not working for me. My kid last night was just bouncing his foot on some, it had that cellophane, so I was within 30 seconds, that was not working for me. He was probably getting some nice feedback to the foot, It was working just fine for him. I couldn't take it. I was like, stop it! He's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, okay. I was trying to send an email, and there was this noise that was bugging me, and, it wasn't working for me. But it's working for him just fine, right? And I think as much as I don't have a lot of love for Dr. Phil, he has brought this one phrase into popular culture that is pretty important. How's that working for you? So if I were to, call up any of your students on your worst, most challenged day and say, so, you spit at her, you hit her, you threw a book at her, how's that working for you? Your student would say, great. Right? I didn't lose her attention all day long. All she did was me all day, right? Or whatever. Or she left me alone all day. Or she took me out of class. But it was working for the student. And that's why they're doing it. And it was working in one of two ways, to get something or to avoid something. Which seems really simple. I say all of our behavior is to get something or avoid something. Really, Wendy? Really? Everything I do? Well, yes, if you put something in the right context of could be anything that exists inside of you or outside of you. So, again, where one student might be very aggressive, to get you to remove them from a class. But another person would be very aggressive just to get you to have to stay with them, right? So one person could be engaging that behavior to avoid or end something. Another person could be doing that same behavior to get something. You know, somebody could be engaging in self-injurious behavior because they have a really bad stomach ache. And so in order to avoid this feeling, I do this, right? Or I think I told the group this morning when I very first gave this training, I had a guy get really upset with me and say, so you're telling me that even Mother Teresa, all of her benevolent acts were to get something or avoid something? And I would say yes. But part of the something is internal. And thought is a lot of what we might work to get or avoid. And so I would say it would depend on how Mother Teresa was raised. Either she did all of these wonderful good deeds because she got a feeling, and it was a really powerful feeling. That feeling you get when you help, you know, it's a good feeling. Or she just had overwhelming guilt, and she had to do all of these good deeds in order to avoid feeling this overwhelming guilt because she should have been doing more, right? We don't know what her associations were, but we know that somehow her behavior was motivated to get something or avoid something, even if part of what you're getting or avoiding is thought or feeling or sensation. So that's how it gets super complicated and very, very individual, based on each person's associations. So what you might work really hard to get, this person might work really hard to avoid. Same thing. And our students are very much like that. And then behavior, of course, you know, I get the shorthand all the time. I get, hey, I work with this kid who has some behaviors. And I always have to laugh a little bit and go, well, at least he has some. Because behavior is anything we do, right? So we all have some behavior. But we even shorthand it. We know that we're talking about problem behavior when we say that. Because behavior is the problem, right? And then if it's really big, the kid becomes the problem, right? I'm sure there are kids right now, you could say, oh, Johnny, you go, oh, right? Because they would have a reputation of their behavior that precedes them. So then Johnny is the problem. But we know Johnny isn't the problem. It's the problem. And his behavior isn't even the problem. It's the context and the frequency of his behavior that is the problem. And so you say, well, Wendy, he spits and he hits and he pokes in the eye and he pulls hair. That is bad behavior. Well, let's put it in this context. I live in North Minneapolis. I'm walking home down the dark alley one night. Somebody comes up, tries to grab me from behind. I turn around, I hit him, I poke him in the eye, I kick him, I spit him, I get away. Are you going to say that was bad behavior? No, my friends would be like, good job, here you go, high five, yay, good behavior, right? You thought you got away. So even really, what seems like really bad behavior, if you put it in the right context, disrobe it, right? Any kids that just whip their clothes up in school, I work with a few, it's a problem. But it turns out that behavior is fine twice a day in your bedroom behind closed doors, at least if you're a girl, maybe a few more times a day. Although frequency can be a problem then too, right? You've got a little girl that changes her clothes 15 times a day, even if it's behind closed doors, it's a problem. Right? So it's a frequency and it's a context thing. That's what we're really trying to change, is when you use which tools, how much and where. I think one of the simplest, it was kind of a neat programming opportunity I had many years ago with a young man who's on the spectrum, and he got big into spitting, and it was all oral sensory stuff. And he got really, like, even he would go, and all of it, but you could tell it was all just like, all about the sensory. Like, he had really honed this spitting action, and he loved it. So he was spending all day spit, 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 and you know how much we like spitting at school or really anywhere. Like, no, gross, germy, don't do it. But he was going to do it. And you weren't going to punish it out of him because the way it felt was already reinforcing. He was going to do it. So we taught him context. We taught him drain. Anything that has a drain. Sink drain, water faucet drain, the sewer drain. So we spent the next year and a half stopping at every drain that existed so he could put a spin in it, but you know, no one minded. because he quickly adapted that rule, and that's the only place he would spit is in a drain. So his staff did not mind taking, 58 pit stops a day because they weren't getting spit on, the floor wasn't getting spit on, the desks weren't getting spit on, so we'll stop at drains. And it was almost like you could tell he really needed to test that. Like, I can spit in every drain. And after about a year and a half, he didn't need to spit in every drain or even half of the drains. And it started to just normalize to when he was feeling the urge, he would go to a drain and do that. And now he's an adult, and I'm not even sure. I think you know how sensory stuff comes and goes. I'm not even sure he really, except outside of brushing his teeth and other times when he's like in the presence of a drain that might remind him to do some of this, he's not doing it, It's not something that's carried on into adulthood for him, but when he was in elementary school, it was a big deal. So, we just addressed the context and a little bit the frequency. And in fact, probably at first the frequency might have gone up if he was testing out all the drains in the world. Another really important ground rule of behavior is that appropriate behaviors are noticed less often. Now this becomes important because of the population of kids that you're working with. So the kids that don't receive special supports, that learn in very typical ways, they get corrected, scolded, redirected by the parents and their teachers early on, and they change. They don't do those things anymore. Because kids that are learning in typical ways find that kind of noticing punitive. To be corrected, no thank you. I don't want that to happen. I will avoid having that happen by making the right choices to the best of my ability, and then maybe I make a mistake and someone corrects that, okay, well, not that again, so I'll change and make the right choices. And so for typically developing or folks that learn sort of in typical ways, this ground rule isn't so much of a big deal. But for all the kids that we're supporting, this becomes a really big deal. Because what this becomes is predictable attention. Do you work with any attention seekers? Anybody ever call your kids attention seeking? Yeah, but a lot of you could raise your hands for that. And the reality is, if they are attention seekers, then this ground rule is part of what's driving that profile for them. Is that problem behavior will get predictably noticed. And this is like a society thing. This isn't like a special education thing, right? I mean, look, we could go out and do every good deed I could think of for the next 3 years. And I may not ever get noticed for that. But I could go out tonight and do one heinous thing and be on the news, guaranteed. Right? And we even see that. I mean, you see some of the profilers of some of our really big notorious criminals, that's actually part of their profile, is that awareness that they would be known. That this act, this one heinous act, and their name will forever be known. Right? So even at that level of mental illness, this is kind of a big deal, right? Predictably, we're going to notice the problem. And so if I'm a kid that just wants to be predictably noticed, then I've got a whole bunch of tools in my toolbox. The garbage behavior, the junk behavior, that's going to do it. People are going to keep calling me out and calling me out and calling me out. And if that's what I'm seeking, then you know what? I can get it.
What was missing when you think in these folks that are attention seeking? Is an environmental deal or something hardwired that either consciously or subconsciously is taking that?
So I think it's probably, it's going to depend on the kid. It's going to depend on the development of that kid. I think that sometimes with some of our kids who are maybe less social functioning and more in the world of sensory, it just becomes predictable like button pushing. It's cause and effect. You got a kid that likes to push buttons and see things light up, then probably they're doing the same thing to you. And so if they found certain behaviors get you to light up predictably, whether it's, snotting all over the floor or wiping something gross on you or making that shrieking sound that no one could stand, you're going to come and you're another light that's going to light up every time I do that. So that would be on that end. I think when we get to that mentally ill profile, where it's about everybody's going to know my name because I'm going to take out a movie theater full of people. I think there's a lot more going on. Probably a history of trauma, but also probably some significant deficit in perspective taking. Because empathy is all about taking the perspective of someone else. And so what I see coming out a lot of times in the profile of these folks is either something that looks an awful lot like a personality disorder, like antisocial, sociopathic, or autism, or Asperger's. And both of these, whether personality disorder, antisocial, or autism, one of their core commonalities is a complete deficit in perspective. Because if there's no you in there, it's a lot easier for me to annihilate you, right? I mean, if this is just a bunch of bodies in this room and there's no person in there, then it's a lot easier to think of all of you, not even to think of you dead. It's to think of me and how people will notice me. And you're just a means to an
Narcissism.
Narcissism is another personality disorder, yeah, so it's very akin to antisocial or sociopathic. But narcissism is often, at its root, a failure to take the perspective of another. I matter a whole lot more if there is no you, right? Which is a skill deficit. And which is part of what, do you see how even just that, like you take this heinous mass murder and you start to understand that they have a profile that includes that they, first of all, never understood that there's another person in there, and then probably were traumatized by some of those non-existent people. And while we don't excuse or say what they do is okay, it actually, I think, opens up a bit of compassion for me to say, I kind of understand, though. I can't endorse it anyway. I certainly, can't imagine the horror of the people that go through these things, but yet, understanding why the behavior happens, and even at an earlier stage, at the stage we're talking about, before it becomes heinous and out of control in that way, I think it allows enough compassion to find a better intervention. Because we can stand on that can't happen all day long and change nothing. That shouldn't be that way is just going to destroy me. Right? Because I'm powerless. If it just shouldn't be that way, but it's not going to miraculously change. And kind of to that point, none of these behaviors challenge the person who's exhibiting them. The kid that just bit you on the arm is not struggling with his choice, that was his solution, not his problem. Even self-injury. They're not looking for a different way to act. That's the way that they're picking. That's the tool. Not because they're bad people, but because of all of these reasons that we're talking about. This is my solution. You're the one that's challenged. And knowing a rule is very different than how we behave. And I'll just speak again from my own experience. I drove down here from Minneapolis today. Which rule did I break? You got it. Speed limit. I sure did. Not excessively. Although my friend says, sometimes you're an excessive speeder, and I'm like, well, that's just redundant. So if I'm speeding, I'm already exceeding the speed limit. So, but yeah, speeding is one rule that, we're all aware of. A large percentage of drivers with licenses, so you know the rule, break driving rules. If not the speed limit, then other driving rules. Blinkers, anybody not use their indicator lights? There's rules about that, You're supposed to tell the people behind you you're about to turn. That's taking an indicator light, right? My hand was busy on my cell phone. Also a rule you're not supposed to be breaking at that time, right? So yeah, we break rules that we're aware of. And here's, for me, not only do I know the rule of the speed limit, but I understand. My knowing goes beyond just speed limit is 55 or speed limit is 60, right? I know about the impact to the environment, to my fuel economy, to my safety, and to the safety of others. So when I break that rule, I break it with full knowledge that I have, lessened my fuel economy, that I've increased my emissions to, global warming, and that I've put myself and others at greater risk of harm should I have an accident. That's what I'm doing when I break that rule, and I know it. But Wendy, why do you break that rule? Why do you break the rule, right? I actually do know why I break the rule. It's sort of weird, but this is sort of the way human behavior is. I'm pretty averse to being out on the road with all you other drivers. I want to get out of that. situation, so I tend to go faster to try to get through it quicker. It feels like I'm getting away from something I don't want quicker. I might be getting right to something I don't want quicker, but this is the way behavior works, right? What's motivating you? Much more important than what is the rule. Now this is for us. This is for me. I think I'm a pretty high-functioning adult. I do all right. But think about the kids we work with. Many times the only way they know the rule is through rote memory. They can recite the rule really well, backward and forward. But they don't know why, what it means, what's behind it. They just can tell you the rule. Let alone, it's really not on their radar right now because it's not what's motivating them. So while we need rules to organize around, just continuing to rehearse and review rules will not change behavior. I can recite to you the speed limits for 2 hours for the rest of our time together. I promise you on my way back up to the cities, there will be at least a point where I will look down and go, oh, I am over 60 miles an hour. Well, 55, especially here when I have to go 55. Oh, so hard. And then finally, and this is where I think we need to have a lot of compassion for us in this process, is because these principles of behavior are the same for us. We are acting in ways to get things we want and avoid things we don't want. What's one of the things you don't want every day that you come to work? The challenging behavior of others, right? You don't want the screaming or the swearing or the spitting or the hitting or the running away or whatever it is. You don't want that. So sometimes we find ourselves doing something that stops the behavior in the moment. A lot of times it might look something like this. Hey, knock it off. Done. Great. I am more likely to do that again next time because you stopped. But what if, you were seeking predictable attention, kind of like you're thirsty, and I came along and said, hey, knock it off, kind of like I gave you a drink. So you stopped because you got predictable attention, but 5 minutes later, you're kind of thirsty again. So this is where we end up practicing behavior stop instead of behavior change. And so what you have to look at is how many times a day, a week, a month, am I having to do this? And if it's over and over and over and over, then what we have is behavior stop. It's working for me because you stopped. It's working for you because, and that's my question to answer. Is it because you're getting their predictable attention? Is it because in that moment you got to put away something else that you what is it in that responding that while you stopped the behavior, an hour later or 10 minutes later or 2 minutes later, you're doing that very same thing to get that very same response from me. And have compassion because of course you're going to keep doing it and you think it works. Every time you do it, they stop. I'll never forget, having to recommend to a group of staff in a group home, it was this loud, persistent, here's the behavior. But it just didn't stop. Never. You could imagine being home for 8 hours of this sound. It would stop, though, if somebody came up and told the gentleman, quiet down, just stop, just be quiet. Anything to acknowledge that he was being loud and he needed to be quiet, he would stop. For about 10 or 15 minutes. But you can imagine a person in 8 hours and 10 or 15 minutes is like an oasis of silence, right? And so when I come to him and say, well, if we're really going to change this behavior, we're going to use something other than telling him to stop, they're like, oh, hell no, we're not. We need our oasis. This is the only way to get our 10 minutes of quiet. So many times what we as interventionists end up having to ask of ourselves is to stand in the presence of something I don't want and not do the thing that I know would stop it. And that's real. This is like back to that classic, so you got your toddler, he's tantruming in the checkout aisle because he wants candy. What are you going to do? Well, if you want him to stop tantruming, some M&Ms. If you wanted never to tantrum again in the checkout aisle, then you are going to have to weather through a nightmare of getting out of the store. You might not even get to buy your stuff. Or if you do, you're going to have every other adult in the place looking at you like you're the worst adult on the planet because you're not handling your kid, right? And then you're going to have to try to get that kid out of the store. And you might have to do that 2 or 3 more times before they will never tantrum in the checkout aisle again. Or you'll tantrum over. So every time I see a parent or really anyone sort of give in, I don't, oh, shh. I'm like, I get it. I get it. I want to do that too. I want to make the alarm stop sounding. But if I want the alarm to stop going off, how am I going to make this kid realize this isn't working for him? And if he wants me to predictably respond, then that's still working for him. Unless I don't. And then that's not working for me right now, but maybe a week from now or a month from now, it'll work for me. So that brings us to the last ground rule of behavior change and why it's so hard. Because the only person's behavior I can really change is mine. Now, I can powerfully impact others around me by doing that. But I got to tell you, I have daily wrestling matches with my ego, even now, understanding this as well as I do. There are days when I feel like I shouldn't have to do it different. Why should it always fall on me to do it different? Well, if I want to make the change, then I have to be the change. I have to do it different. And it's not easy. I'm no more welcoming of change. I'm still using my iPhone with a 3 or 4 times ago operating system on it. Because it was the one where they updated the iPhone and changed the whole format and the calendar and everything's different. So I just won't update mine. Because I don't want a new calendar. I mean, I'm averse to change too, but at the end of the day, I'm all I have to make a difference. I can do it different, or it can be the way it is. So the other piece to just touch on with behavior change is kind of the common tools that we use in behavior change is often what I call, well, it is technically behavior modification. This is our common parenting tools. Well, before this, it was really, before B.F. Skinner gave us this technology, especially parenting and the way we treated kids was horrific. So this technology has done us a world of good to know how to use consequence. However, we are now at a place where even this technology has us often stopped, or in places that just aren't working. And more, even right now, the state is shutting down how we can use some of this technology relative to punishment. What they've said is you can't. You can't use aversives. So you can't intentionally use aversives to punish. And yet, I will talk about, we still use punishment. We do. And we will and we should. Because punishment has gotten a really bad rap in some of this. And so, part of what I'd like to clear up for us now is the language, because we all make our associations through language and what we think something means. So I want to be very specific, and I ask that you try to listen carefully to this part, because this is going to be important as you move through your year. Anything that happens after a behavior is a consequence. Whatever happens after behavior is the consequence. And there can be 2 kinds of consequences technically. They can be reinforcing, and that just means that they made it more likely that you do that behavior again. Or they can be punishing, and that just means that they make it less likely that you do that behavior again. Those are the facts about consequences. I hear this conversation a lot. Steve has been getting away with this behavior all year. When are we going to use a consequence? What are we going to use? When are we going to give Steve a consequence for that behavior? That's a misuse of the language, first of all. But part of what it does in our association is I think that we still have this sort of, it's like the unicorn. The consequence is the unicorn. that there's something out there that if we would just find it and apply it to Steve, he would never do that behavior again. Let's find that consequence. So, start with clearing up the language. Because if we want to make sure Steve doesn't do that again, what kind of consequence are we asking for? Punishment. Now let's have the conversation. We need the right punishment for Steve. What punishment are we going to use? We've got to come up with a punishment so he doesn't keep getting away with this. Now it's a fair conversation, and now you start to see the barriers to finding that consequence. Right? Because it isn't just this magical, if we could just give him the right consequence. No. We want a specific kind. We want punishment. Except we're very limited in our ability to even do that in a federal school setting. We can't. In a planful sort of aversive way, right? We can't do that. But even if we could, because let's start with the easy one. Let's start with reinforcement. Makes it more likely you'll do behavior. What's a reinforcer? Anybody can name a reinforcer for me? Attention? Food? iPad? Any others that come to mind when I think what is a or say what is a reinforcer?
More recess time.
More recess time? The way something makes you feel, getting a good feeling.
Reward.
So it's your reward. So all of a sudden, yeah, we start to get to this, well, it's about the individual. Right? Because as much as I have a really hard time, even with all my phenomenal perspective taking skills, I have a super hard time believing there are people that are food averse. Turns out there are people that are not motivated by food. You can hold out chocolate all day long, they will not move. I mean, I would like bowl you over to get your chocolate, but yeah, some people not food motivated. Could not reinforce them with food. What was attention was another one? You ever met the kid that if you say, good job tying your shoe, they'll literally untie their shoe and then untie their other shoe and then untie your shoe just to make sure that you know that they weren't going to do that if you were going to tell them good job for that? I work with a lot. This one kid, if you would accidentally praise him, he could back up like the last 50 steps. It's like as if he just hit a delete, and just all the progress he had made. And he would literally erase things on his page if you told him, nice job. So he might have been attention motivated, but certainly not in a praise way. In fact, I wrote a whole program this was a 65-year-old fella, that his primary reinforcer was attention, but scolding. And so at the time that I met him, his days looked like this. You left your keys laying around, he would grab your keys, he'd run outside, he'd hide them in a tree. He'd go in his roommate's room, he'd take his roommate's shoes, put them under the couch. Just all day long, so that we'd find him and be like, John, what the heck? What did you do that for? Knock it off. Like, this is what people all do. And his response? Just like, he just loved getting scolded. In fact, he even walked around doing this because he loved it so much. And so I wrote the program, and I showed up on the night that we implemented the program, and the staff thought I was literally nuts. And very so, but it did work. And the program looked like this. I sat down next to it, because one of the things, so you finish eating, you take your plate to the sink, you rinse it off, put it in the dishwasher. Well, not John. He'd take his plate to the fridge, or take his plate to the toilet, or take, just anywhere else that he could get scolded. Like, he would just get so creative about where he could take his plate so that somebody would have to say, John, what are you doing? Knock it off. Get it in the sink. So I sat down next to him, he's finishing the meal. I said, John, I tell you what, if you take that plate to the sink, I'm going to be so mad at you, I'm going to scream. John, no! Not in the sink. Do not do that. All right, don't you rinse that and put it in the dishwasher. I told you, no. Right? Like, oh my God. And I lost. Like, oh my God. I can't believe you just rinse that dish and put it in the dishwasher. What's the matter with you? He literally bust every housemate's dish, rinsed it off, and put it in the dishwasher. And the whole program was, if he does it right, scold him. Because for him, that was a reinforcer. Not a punishment. It was a reinforcer. And we were able to get more and more, better and better behavior, as long as everything he did was like, John, what are you doing? Knock it off. Ah, you. I mean, he would just do the whole day right according to plan, as long as you chew him out for every part of it. So reinforcement seems simple on the surface of it. And you've probably had those conversations where you say, well, let's come up with a list of reinforcers for this kiddo. But remember that all you're doing is coming up with a list of potential good deals. And they are only reinforcers if they're willing to work, if they're going to do something to get it. Right? They're motivated by it. They'll increase their behavior to get it. Then you have an actual reinforcement. And it's hard to contrive. Token systems, stickers, candies, gums. There's a reason why these things often fail. Because we don't have actual reinforcers. We had potential good deals, but they didn't serve as reinforcers. And as hard as that is, punishment is infinitely harder to try to contrive. Timeout? You ever tried to time out someone on the spectrum that engages in STEM? Especially if it's like body STEM, you can't take a time out from that. You take it with you. You can sit in a locked, quiet room all day, actively engaged, fully reinforced. There is no time out if the reinforcement is like within me. I mean, you even hear about prisoner of wars who sat in their little prison cell and just in their mind were free the entire time. They just kept that right mental attitude where they were never imprisoned, because in their mind they continued to find good and positivity and things that motivated them to keep going. So then it's hard to even say he's in prison, right? With all of that environmental control. So punishment is really hard to contrive. Well, again, I think about even the most significant, like kiddos I've worked with where holding, like physical holding, restraints, are actually reinforcing. So they would behave in ways to get put in a restraint. I mean, I've had people like come up, clock me, and then turn around and kids do this, like, okay, I'll give you another one, right? Or a guy that, he was transition age, so we eventually had to teach him to ask to be held. He was so reinforced by holding that our only alternative was to teach him to communicate that with functional communication rather than with his behavior. And then we put him in a full-on hold when he asked for it. So the things that we think are reinforcing or punitive probably filtered a lot through our lens. In fact, when the evidence is so clear, when you do a survey, like if I were to ask you about your student to rank what you think their most preferred reinforcers would be, and then I were to test that, almost every study that's ever been done on that shows that your ideas will be almost 100% wrong. The data is that poor on it. On other people, even parents with their kids. It's very, very difficult to know what will reinforce and even sometimes to know what will punish. So it's not that we don't use that technology, but we need to use it through this lens of assessment. And what that is looking at what already happens for this student around any behavior, good or bad. What happens before it? That's the A, the antecedent. The B is the behavior. And the C is the consequence. What already happens after the behavior? Because likely that's part of what is continuing to maintain, reinforce that behavior. What's already there? So I need to understand why you're already operating the way you are so that I can figure out how to manipulate those consequences, but also, because the other part of that A that I don't have up there, there's another C you can put out in front, so it says C-A-B-C, and that's the context. It's sort of the setting events. It's time of day. Did you sleep last night? Did you take your med today? Are you in a bad mood? Does your stomach hurt, right? That sort of context, and then the antecedent, what happens right before your behavior? What is your behavior? And then what is the consequence that's already occurring? Well, that context and that antecedent, turns out we can use a lot of intervention at those times before behavior ever occurs. And that is exactly what positive-based proactive supports means. It means we're intervening around the context and the antecedent to change the behavior so we don't have to work so much with the consequence. But when we do have to work with the consequence, we want to make sure that what we're having happen for you, hopefully, isn't a reinforcer, right? That we don't want to make it more likely that you do that again. And so we have to look through that lens. We have to recognize that this behavior is functional for you. That's why you're doing it. And that those factors that make it functional are going to be about who you are in the world, about how you're wired, and about your social environment. All of it.